Hello, Where We Are listeners. If you're a longtime fan of this podcast or you're just joining us for the first time today, we want to tell you more about our podcast platform called Spotify for Podcasters. We've been using this platform for over a year, and it's been easy to use, and new features are added all the time. You can record and edit podcasts from your phone or computer. You don't need anything fancy, and you don't need previous podcast experience. When you hit publish, you will distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify if that's your kind of thing. And with Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. But here's the thing, you can earn money, but it's a free platform. There's no catch. If you're curious or want to see what it's all about, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
You're listening to Where We Are, which is brought to you by the That Sounds Fun Network. This week we'll begin a two-part series ahead of the midterm elections. Just a few months ago, there were prognostications that Democrats were heading for a bloodbath in the midterm elections, but things have changed. Democrats are beginning to feel like they may buck the historical trends, and so in this two-part series, we will lay out the case for both parties. This week, we'll describe some of the factors that are leading even us to think that Democrats might have the chance to surprise folks this November. Next week, we'll make the case for Republicans. We're excited to dive in with you. This is Where We Are.
It's the end of the weekend, but I still wanna turn up. Yeah, I still wanna.
This is Where We Are. We are the Wares. I'm Michael.
I'm Melissa.
And Melissa, we're recording from Atlanta. Hotlanta. Jermaine Dupri walks in. And looking forward to this episode. Again, it's the first of a two-part series, and it really came out of, and if folks listen back to earlier episodes, we talked for quite some time, like it was sort of inevitable that Democrats were going to take significant losses this November. And there were and continue to be good reasons why that might be the case. We'll talk about those next week. But the idea of this two-part series is, now that we're past Labor Day, we're in kind of the final stretch, really, of these midterm election campaigns. We thought it would be a good opportunity, rather than to make predictions at this point, to spend an episode each laying out the reasons for each party to be hopeful heading into November, kind of their best case scenario or their best case argument for being optimistic in November. It would have been very hard to do this kind of series.
Yeah, that's right. Just a few months
ago, because not even many Democrats were willing to make that case, and so that's the idea. Again, next week we'll. So this episode, we're not going to sort of be making counter arguments. If you're listening to this episode and you're like, "Oh, this seems overly rosy for Democrats," we think it is too. That's the whole point. Mm-hmm. This is what are the factors that sort of what are the factors that are to the benefit of Democrats, and then next week we'll talk about the various factors that are in favor of Republicans doing well. Melissa, what do you think? Should we let's jump in?
Sure, let's dive right in.
First, Melissa, let's sort of set the stage. So we're, as we've discussed before, there are all kinds of offices that will be decided this November. We're focusing in these 2 episodes on Congress,
That's
on
right.
the House and the Senate, because state environments are different and can need to be analyzed sort of differently. So we're talking about the balance of power in the House and the Senate. The current status quo is 50 senators who caucus with the Democrats and 50 Republicans in the Senate. So Democrats have control of the Senate currently by virtue of having the White House and specifically the vice presidency. But it's the Senate itself is evenly split. Democrats have a slim advantage in the House as well, and so that's the current sort of arrangement in the Senate. So in November, every House seat is up for election. Members of the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. In the Senate, about a third of Senate seats are up for re-election every 2 years because senators are elected to terms of 6 years. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the Senate. We're talking about the House. Democrats currently control both by very slim margins. I think the best place to start, Melissa, is with the generic ballot.
That's right.
And so the generic ballot refers to, surveys that ask people just, would you rather have a Republican or a Democrat in Congress? So it doesn't name specific individuals. It's a national poll, so it's not of a specific state or congressional district. But Democrats were behind by about 3 points.
Yeah, that's right.
Just in May, June. And we've seen really since late July,
that's right,
Democrats start to climb to the point where now the average in these surveys has Democrats up about 1.5 points. Now, for context, because of how sort of the history of these polls, there are some analysts who say, for Democrats to do really well in a House election, they need to be doing better in the generic ballot by 3 or 4 points over Republicans.
Something more significant.
But this is still the market improvement for Democrats is one sign that they're building strength, that they have momentum heading into November. So that's a strong sign that nationally they have momentum at their side in September. We'll see how it develops into November, but the generic ballot is looking much better for them than it was for basically the entire year.
Yes, it's about January.
Yeah. We'll talk about this more next week, but it's just important to note the history here. It's very difficult for the party that has the White House to gain seats in these midterm elections. The history is sort of against them on that, which is one of the main reasons, along with some other reasons we'll cover next week. But yeah, the generic ballot is looking
more positive in the last month and a half. Yeah,
that's right. And now, right, the question is like, what are the reasons that the generic ballot has gotten better? And Melissa, what have you picked up on there?
Well, based on timing, if we're talking about end of July with polling here on these generic ballots, across a lot of them, not just, a single generic ballot like 538, we're talking about others like Rasmussen and all the major ones, is the timing of the Dobbs abortion decision seems to be a highly motivating factor if you're looking just at the generic ballot and the timing of when we've been seeing sort of increases and things starting to go more towards Democrats in general. And then we are seeing other reports, like there's some reporting on women especially, and the trends there in generic men overall ballots. It's showing that women seem to be more motivated because of Dobbs and because of this abortion decision. And then there's some polling on young people and how Dobbs is motivating young people. And that particular one is coming out of Politico, where young people are being motivated by Dobbs. Now, obviously, and again, we're just going to be bringing up a few caveats, just the ones that are like the most apparent to us. We're again making the case for Democrats, but when it comes to young people, even if they seem to be motivated, it remains to be seen when it comes to the actual election day what kind of turnout there is, because younger people tend to vote less. So there's Dobbs. And, just speaking to generally, because of this generic ballot, because of this momentum, the media is talking about the momentum. And so there is a general feeling, I think, as well with, Democrats are leading Republicans on who will definitely vote in midterms. There just seems to be more of a fervor, more of a likeliness to vote than Republicans right now with some polling. There is a poll out that's saying that even if you're unfavorable towards President Biden, you're still that there's plenty of people who are still more likely to vote Democrat, despite the fact that they might even be unfavorable towards President Biden. And I think that we're potentially seeing that this midterm election, if it were to go into Democrats' favor, that this election is more about issues than it will be about a referendum on President Biden himself. And I think that that's a key distinction here. And not often, and especially in the years where, and please disagree with me, Michael, in the few times, maybe a couple times really, in the past several decades of why an electorate would choose the current party that's in power in the White House is sort of in spite of that power. It's more towards issues or something that's going on currently in that societally or in politics. And that might be what we might end up seeing, and why, in the end, we might buck historical trends.
Yeah. I mean, so you brought up quite a bit. On Dobbs, I've been convinced that it's not just media and sort of advocacy group puffery that is suggesting that Dobbs will motivate people to turn out for Democrats and to vote Democratic. I've been convinced by some of the numbers we're seeing, by how some of these special elections have gone, and so I do think that's a real factor, and it could be a deciding factor. If we're making the case for Democrats on this episode, which we are, I think if Democrats do well in November, it is likely it will be because, well, on the history of abortion, typically conservatives have been the ones who have ranked the issue more highly in terms of their priorities when voting, and conservatives have been more motivated to turn out because of the issue. If that flips, which there's good reason to, we've had Roe for 50 years, and this is the first national election where we were post-Roe. And so I wrote on the Substack this week about something I call the aggressor principle.
Right.
And you could check that out at reclaiminghope.substack.com. But the aggressor principle here is in Democrats' favor, especially now, given the fact that Republicans haven't seemed too willing to push back and make their case for why getting rid of Roe was a good thing. They've been pretty muted on the subject and have allowed Democrats to really control the narrative about the impact of the Dobbs decision and the falling of Roe. So that has to be a top of the line reason to think that Democrats have a real chance at having a successful November. I also want to pick up on another thing you mentioned, which is so it traditionally has been a really good way to sort of figure out how the midterms are going to go by looking at the approval rating of the incumbent president. There are signs that sort of way of that predictive method has lost power because of polarization.
Yeah.
I'd also add sort of to that, I think internal party dynamics for the Democratic Party have made that less likely. So part of the vast number of Americans who disapprove of President Biden are doing so from the right, but there are given sort of the tension within the Democratic Party, given some of the critiques of Biden, I think those who disapprove of Biden, it's like a bit more of a broader spread. Like there's a wider spread of reasons for that. And so Amy Walter at the Cook Political Report this week was expressing, and Amy Walter is one of the experts of looking at midterm elections, the history of midterm elections, assessing how the parties are going to fare. And she said that she's never seen such a high percentage of voters who think unfavorably about Biden voting to keep his party in office. That's a very promising sign.
Yes.
Like if one of the major underpinnings of the reason why it's hard to of the historical trend of the party in power losing seats, if one of the major underpinnings from that is no longer valid because of polarization, then that's a really good reason to think, not only is the historical trend going to be bucked in this instance, but that we may need to think about midterm elections differently moving forward. So I think that's really interesting. Now, just to add to that, we have seen President Biden's approval rating move up.
Yeah, it started to tick up.
And so, again, in that same post where I talked about the aggressor principle, I mentioned at the very end, I wrote some supplementary analysis to last week's episode about Biden's Philly speech, and I mentioned at the end of that of the Substack essay that one way to view the speech that Biden gave in Philly was as a sort of concession that his approval rating isn't going to reach 50, but that he still had enough strength to dictate the course of the conversation.
Right.
And I think the way his approval rating is going, I think that just about matches. So we've seen President Biden's approval rating get up to the 45% territory, which is, not fantastic. Any president is going to want to be at 50 or above. But in this time of polarization, it's actually a fairly strong position for him to be in. And it means that the headwinds against his party, if that number holds, won't be quite as strong. And then just, I'd add to that, I think people often will underestimate how an incumbent president is going to do and how their party is going to do too early in their term, because in the early stages of their term, they're working primarily to get stuff done. And it's messy. and they're putting out a ton of decisions, and to varying degrees, they're not focused on making their case to the American people.
And we have seen that. And you and I have complained about that a little bit.
But I think we've seen a much more visible, advocacy-oriented White House.
That was going to be one of the next things I was going to say.
Yeah, please,
what you're talking about at the end of the Philly speech about the White House having found, it seems, messaging and narratives that seem to be working for a lot of the electorate, whereby they're making their case better and it's being understood, so that the White House has been pointing to it, especially for the last 2 months, all of the administration's efforts and victory. So not just the victories, but also the efforts. And so that's why I say, some people might be able to vote for Democrats in spite of whatever they feel about President Biden, because the White House has been laying out much better than they have since, January, when the president first came in and started getting things done in the first 100 days. They've been messaging it, packaging it so much better than they have been. And one of the things, like the key thing that I've been noticing is just straight up confidence. That what they've done is good. What they've done has been helpful to the American people. What they've done has improved the economy, has improved American lives. And they seem like they're just, the way that they're crafting their messaging is much more offensive than defensive. There's just been slight semantic, rhetorical language changes.
Completely agree.
That communicate forward footing rather than backward footing. Or defensive footing. And I feel like that has made a huge difference, not just in how the media covers the presidency and the administration and the Democrats in general, but that the average American, when they're hearing these messages or these arguments, it's just communicating in a much smoother, cleaner, clarifying way. Now, whether or not people are convinced by it, obviously, is another thing, but at least people are being given the chance to understand exactly what the president has achieved, I would say.
Yeah.
And especially because, we've been hearing, there have been leaks, from the administration itself that they've been so frustrated that they haven't been given credit where credit is due on, like the infrastructure bill, for example, and how hard it was to even get to that point, and the fact that infrastructure bills are actually really notoriously hard to pass. Getting anything done in infrastructure has been historically hard to pass. It's kind of like, come on now, just right there, if we're thinking about a specific example. I think that that's big in terms of, again, that feeling of momentum, that feeling of, maybe we might buck historical trends. Let's kind of go on a more forward footing.
Yeah. There was a survey that came out this past week that David Leonhardt highlighted that really was the reason I specifically said we should do this episode.
Yes.
And that is David Leonhardt, and we'll include this in the show notes. There was a New York Times Morning Consult poll, and this really is the first number I've seen that really shocked me. So I haven't been surprised to see Democrats gain strength with women or young voters in response to Dobbs.
Yep.
Maybe to see one poll showed a 20-point swing among Hispanic women towards Democrats. That is a notable number. If Democrats perform much better with Hispanic voters than they did in 2020, that's promising. Yeah. But this is the number that really surprised me. Which party has handled COVID better overall? 45% say Democrats compared to 32% of Republicans. I was blown away by that.
Yeah, I thought for sure the feeling towards Democrats that they're the party of school shutdowns, they're the party of masks, the party of vaccines, whatever you want to call it, all the polarization around COVID, that really started to happen a bit more into President Biden's administration, because as COVID went on,
Well,
polarization around this issue started to rise, and with merit in a lot of the time in certain ways.
And Biden has been, president now for a year and a half, and it just you kind of own the issue when you've been president for that long, typically, but. So like one of two things: either the American people, or it could be a combination of both. Either the American people remember and still hold against Republicans how they handled the initial stages of COVID, particularly President Trump, or they've taken a look and based on their sort of honest assessment, they might say, yes, mistakes were made, but like we remember what a complicated, frightening, unprecedented sort of situation it was. And sort of given that, we think Democrats have done, that they favor that Democrats have done a better job. And so for me, I thought coming into this midterm election that COVID was going to be one of the bigger strengths that Republicans were going to have. And not even, yes, you can make substantive arguments why that should be the case. But I also just thought, Democrats kind of own this now by virtue of being in power. And that alone will work against them. Yeah. And, if COVID actually gives Democrats... If Democrats haven't just neutralized, if Democrats aren't just not harmed by COVID in November, but if voters actually reward them for how they handled COVID, that's a game changer for me. So this is the first number I saw where I was like, wow, maybe the electorate really is in a different mood.
I want to ask you something. This might be something that's a bit too adjacent, but in the apps, we're in midterms. We're not talking about a general election or like a presidential election. Sorry, misspoke there. We're not talking about general election for a presidency. We're talking about a general election for a midterm for Congress here. Right now, we're in an interesting period of American history where we don't really have. I'm a foreign policy person, so I can make all kind of arguments here, but I'm talking about a broad general feeling or general issue that Americans would care about towards like national security. We really don't have one right now because we're not really in a war footing. Yes, we're supporting Ukraine. We continue to put, President Biden continues to request money from Congress for that. But we ourselves, we're pulled out of Afghanistan. There's no other major war that we're trying to get ourselves into. Domestic terrorism is obviously a concern for a lot of people. Clearly, we had the democracy speech last week, but foreign terrorism isn't an issue. That when it comes to like the security mom type voter, it makes me think of this number right here on the handling of COVID.
Oh, that's super interesting.
Because when we talk about COVID, I think it implicates more so children and schooling and education. Yeah. But more so than any other issue when it comes to, generally education. And we know that the economy and all sort of things, but all stemming from COVID really, like with, worries of teacher shortages and all stuff like that. If the security moms feel like Democrats are generally have handled COVID better, that in a time when we're sort of have a vacuum of something national security to be voting on, that this sort of fills the vacuum. What do you think of that kind of thesis?
Oh, I think it's fascinating. And, obviously there are arguments, it may cut both ways, but I think it's really interesting. I'd love to see write-ups on that. And maybe you're the person to do the write-up. But no, I think it's really interesting to think about the ways that sort of constituency that was significant.
I'm actually just realizing I'm using a term here that not everybody might know. Can you explain what a security mom is?
Yeah, so security mom, that was during the Bush years,
Which Bush?
George W. Bush.
Yes.
Karl Rove made popular this idea of micro-targeting. And there were a number of various very specific kind of voter profiles that gained prominence, but probably the most significant, and this was I'm pretty sure my recollection is right here. This was the security mom was really a feature in 2004.
Yeah. I'd say that's right.
And it was a reference to the idea that moms with particular concerns over the basic safety of their families, particularly in light of terrorism, were voting for Bush in 2004. Right. That they had sort of part of the idea here was female voters weren't traditionally associated with prioritizing foreign policy high in their sort of voting priorities. Mm-hmm. They were typically appealed to on the basis of healthcare, on the basis of education.
Right.
But this was sort of the Bush political operation saying, no, we can go after women and particularly mothers on this issue of national security. And so that's the context
That
here.
is what I mean by security mom. And so I'm thinking when there's a vacuum of a national security concern when we're coming into a general election, I wonder if this issue of COVID fills it in, and if we're seeing such a positive, well, it's not like hugely positive, but a surprisingly positive for you and I, for Democrats. I'm wondering, might that fill the void for that type of voter?
Right. And I mean, to your point, if that's the case, it wouldn't just be, and we're sort of like, Melissa, we didn't talk about this idea prior to, and this is like, this could be a whole episode. If this is a thing, so for instance, if we see in November, this is such an interesting thing to look at, and we'll make sure to have special attention to this, both in the run-up to the election, but as we do our post-election coverage, we'll sort of revisit this. If we see Democrats with a marked improvement among moms, yes, we can look at COVID, but we'll look differently, I think, on the importance of Democrats' focus on guns. Mm-hmm. We'll look differently. I mean, you could even say that they're making a case. Democrats have made a case around climate change and this sort of protect your kids' future sort of thing. And so yeah, no, I love this. I love this idea. This is like the headline out of this episode. You know, are Democrats cultivating sort of the next generation of security moms as a demographic.
You can see it a bit already, because one of the other reasons why I mentioned this is that you can see it already with how they've messaged the Dobbs decision and how they're speaking specifically to people who already are moms when we're talking about that particular issue, and the messaging around, like, remember how, how hard pregnancy is, and how can you ask somebody to go through that if they don't want to, kind of thing. I've seen so many arguments around that I could see them even, using all kinds of issues. And that one, if that's we're already talking about that being such a motivating issue in the first place, that I could absolutely see Democrats testing all of this out with this election coming up in November, and then cultivating, especially for 2024, this particular type of voter, especially in the absence of traditional national security issue, securitizing a lot of other issues.
Yeah.
Which we see all the time, the securitization of a lot of different issues.
No, right. So, Republicans are pushing back on this by talking about crime, by talking about sort of parents' involvement in education. So this is a battle, but I think the case you're laying out here is Democrats this isn't 2004 anymore. Democrats seem to have created a number of ways to appeal to this constituency. So I think that's super interesting. The last thing I want to cover, sort of as we think about Democrats, why Democrats might be successful in November, is this issue of candidates, and particularly this is particularly salient when we talk about the Senate.
Yes,
which is look, there are over 30 Senate seats up for re-election, but less than a dozen are expected to be competitive. And you look at those dozen, and Republicans, at least in 3 of those seats, seem to have, and really you could make an argument for more than that, seem to have some pretty profoundly flawed candidates in those races. So I'm thinking of Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. I'm thinking of Herschel Walker in Georgia. Blake Masters in Arizona. That people were impressed by, or maybe just sort of surprised by some of his ads and thought, oh, this guy's doing something interesting.
Right.
It's seeming to potentially fall flat. Now, again, I just want to remind folks, next week we'll make all kinds of arguments for why these candidates might overperform, and we'll make arguments about some of the Democratic candidates. But it seems we've talked recently about Republicans pulling out money from supporting a candidate like Blake Masters.
Yeah, pulling a lot of ad money.
And so it seems like in some of these key states that if you just looked at, Republican registration in the state, how Republicans have performed in the past, where they should be on a really strong footing, that they're not. And candidate recruitment seems to have had a lot to do with that. And I mean, another way to look at this is, I think Stacey Abrams is a stronger and more effective candidate than Raphael Warnock. But Stacey Abrams is running against Brian Kemp.
Yes. And
Warnock's running against Herschel Walker.
Yes.
Now, of course, Kemp's an incumbent, all that. I think the main point is, Republicans could have recruited a candidate that has real political history and networks across the state. Herschel Walker doesn't have that, and I think we're seeing that show up in how his campaign is functioning. And so that's the candidate recruitment piece is the failures on the Republican side. I think we could also add, we'll see in November if sort of the Democrats' emphasis on what they're now calling MAGA Republicans, but sort of Democratic efforts to, which, we're not supportive of, but it's just the reality, to what extent will, these right-wing candidates who won primaries prove to be weak in general elections. Yep. Now that's something that's going to be much more live on the, that is going to be live both on the Senate side and the House side. Right. So I think if Democrats perform well, Republicans could be looking back and saying, gosh, we really botched this opportunity to win back the House and or the Senate, and the candidates were a big reason why.
I just want to mention one last obvious piece of evidence out there too towards this point of the quality of candidates is that Senator Mitch McConnell has even cited candidate quality as an issue, that he is thinking that the House may flip, but the Senate may not because of this candidate quality issue.
Yeah, no, super interesting. there are obviously other reasons, and I'm sure we'll be surprised. If Democrats do well, there will be surprises, sort of about why they did well. I mean, we haven't talked that much about the fact that maybe by the time we get to November, some of the things like an easing of inflation, falling gas prices, those things will begin. The economy generally, yes, will sort of these improvements will add up to an electorate that just feels much better about the direction than they even currently do now.
Yes.
So that's gonna be, if Democrats are successful, the fact that the economy is in a different position now than it was in the first quarter of this year, like that'll be a big reason. Like when elections are held matter, quite a bit. We'd love to hear from you whether you plan to vote for a Democrats or any Democrat this November or not. If you had to say, what would be your top reasons why you think Democrats would be successful this November? We'll again ask you about Republicans next week, but we'd love to hear from you. You could reach out to us over Twitter, Instagram. Check in on the Substack at reclaiminghope.substack.com. This episode is not a prediction episode. We're not saying Democrats are going to keep the House and the Senate. Here's what I will say, though, Melissa.
Okay.
Which is, if a majority of voters approve of Democrats' handling of COVID among the midterm election electorate, I don't think they lose the House and the Senate.
Okay.
Here's another thing that we haven't talked about, which is, I think another reason why we're seeing an improvement among Democrats in the generic ballot is because Donald Trump has been in the news.
Yes.
And so if Donald Trump continues to insert himself into this midterm election campaign, he's been doing rallies for candidates, that could play a significant role. The general thought here is Republicans would very much like for this to be a referendum on Democrats. Yep. They think if the focus is on Democrats, they'll do a better job. Well, it's really hard for that to be the case if Donald Trump, who still has very low approval ratings in this country, is reminding the American electorate that he's still sort of the top Republican. When anyone thinks of Republicans, they think of Donald Trump still. That's one of the ways I think the Republican Party has been harmed by not having at least the House or the Senate. Mm-hmm. If they had the House, they'd have a speaker. They'd have a new face of the Republican Party. But because they're not in the White House, they don't have control of the House or Senate, Donald Trump is still the de facto leader of the Republican Party in many ways. And so that's another factor why Democrats might do well this November, because Donald Trump is still very much in the news. A future presidential campaign is very much on the table. Republican candidates are constantly asked about Donald Trump. And so that helps break up some of the, previously. So in 2010, mm-hmm. George W. Bush wasn't in the news, in 1994, George H.W. Bush wasn't
That's right.
Kicking up a whole storm. These were elections where the opposing party could really focus on the president in the White House. Yep. But it's just a different scenario this time around. And so for all those reasons, and the reasons that you think, listener, Democrats might have a real shot at keeping both the House and the Senate this November, and how things play out over the next 2 months, now less than 2 months, will determine, play a significant role in determining that. Melissa, any final words before we end this episode?
I guess my only final word is anything that we're basing off of polling. I've become.
Oh, that's yes.
And this is going to be my major caveat, which will set us up perfectly for next week of why Republicans would win.
Yes.
Polling, especially since 2016, when polling was so incredibly wrong when it came to how much momentum and power President Trump held before we actually had the election. And I know the Electoral College came into play and Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and all that, but still, the polling was quite off. And since that time, polling has proven that it is still not gotten a handle on polarization in the American electorate. So anytime we're citing polling in this entire episode, I'm sitting back going, well, it's been very wrong.
Well, right, and that's one of the, we're not doing the counter arguments.
I know, sorry.
But if we were going to do the counter arguments, and just, as you said, a preview of next week, I think one of the key things you could say for Republicans is, the polling isn't as good as you'd like, but if you look at the polls of Senate races in 2020, there was actually someone who just put out an analysis of this. Republicans were the Republican candidate in like a dozen key races was significantly underperformed their actual performance in the polls, including, in Maine, polling was off by double digits.
Oh, yes, I remember that, yeah.
It was supposed to be a foregone conclusion that Susan Collins was going to lose that race. The polling was clear. She ends up winning. But there were other races where the Republican outperformed what they were polling as significantly. And so that is the...
I'm sorry, I broke our rule.
Yeah, you broke our rule.
I broke the cardinal rule of part one of this podcast.
But so the argument for Democrats is maybe the pollsters got their act together.
Yeah. Here we go.
Hey,
Nate Silver will rise again.
Yeah.
out of the ashes like a phoenix. Oh no, not on fire, because that's when they're actually okay. I'm sorry.
It has been so good being with you. Thanks for listening to this episode. You can listen to the Morning 5 Monday through Thursday, and we'll be back for part 2 of this series, where we'll talk about the reasons Republicans have to be optimistic about November's elections. Until then, this has been Where We Are. Thank you for listening.
Bye.